Elira's world fell apart the day her father's debt was called in. She had always known her father was a man of risks. He gambled, he borrowed, and he believed fortune would always favor him in the end. But fortune had limits, and this time, luck had abandoned him. When the Dreskari enforcers came to their small settlement, Elira realized her life was no longer her own. The Dreskari were not like humans. They were taller, stronger, with bronze-colored skin that shimmered faintly under, the sun and eyes that glowed as if embers burned inside them. They were warriors feared across systems, and they never forgot a debt. To them, debts were sacred, and if one could not pay with wealth, one paid with blood, with years, or with service. Her father had nothing left to give, no money, no land, no future. So when the leader of the enforcers had looked at Elira, standing behind her father's shaking frame, she felt the weight of his decision before the words were spoken. "She will repay it," the alien said. "She will marry one of us." Elira's heart had stopped. Marry? To pay her father's foolishness? It felt like a cruel joke, but there was no laughter. The Dreskari were not known for mercy, and so the arrangement was made. She would wed a captain named Kale, a warrior with scars on his hands and a voice that carried the authority of command. She had never met him before, never spoken a single word to him. But within a single cycle she was dressed in ceremonial garments, her wrists bound in silver cords, and led into a hall filled with strangers. The ceremony was unlike any human wedding she had seen. No flowers, no music, no joy. The Dreskari. Traditions were sharp and solemn. Fires burned in iron bowls, casting shadows across their faces. Words were spoken in a deep guttural language she barely understood. Elira's hands trembled as she repeated the vows they had taught her. Her voice was weak, cracking with fear, but still she spoke, because she had no choice. Her father's life, her family's survival, rested on her obedience. Across from her stood Kale. He was taller than the others, his eyes glowing faintly gold. His face was hard, unreadable, as if carved from stone. When he spoke his vows, his voice was steady, deep and final. He did not look at her like a woman. He looked at her like a duty. And that, more than anything, broke her heart. When the silver cords were tied together, sealing their bond, Elira felt the chains close around her soul. She had dreamed of a future once, of choosing her own path, of love, of freedom. All of that was gone. Her life had been sold to cover her father's mistakes. The hall erupted in a low chant as the ceremony ended. The Dreskari called her wife. The word burned her ears. Kyle turned to her then, and for a moment their eyes met. She searched for cruelty, for mockery, for the hunger of a man who had just claimed ownership over her. But she found none of that. His gaze was calm, steady, and strangely distant, as if he too carried a weight he did not want. He offered his hand. She hesitated, then placed hers in his, her skin trembling against the roughness of his palm. He did not squeeze. He did not drag her forward. He simply held her, and together they left the hall. Outside, the air was cold, the stars sharp against the black sky. Elira wrapped her arms around herself, feeling smaller than she ever had before. This was her life now. A fortress in an alien land. A husband she did not know. A marriage that was not hers to choose. That night, lying on a bed in a room too large and too empty, Elira cried silently into her pillow. She hated her father for what he had done. She hated the Dreskari for taking her. And she hated Kale most of all, for standing there calm and strong, as if this union was nothing but a duty. She vowed then and there she would never forgive him. She would never accept this marriage. She would never let herself feel anything for him. But deep inside, where she would never admit it, a small whisper lingered. He didn't look at me like a monster would, and that confused her more than anything else. The fortress where Elira now lived felt nothing like a home. It was made of dark metal and stone, carved into sharp angles, its walls rising high as if they wished to keep the world away. The Dreskari called it strong and safe. To Elira, it felt like a cage. Her new husband, Kale, gave her a room of her own. It was larger than her entire house back in the human settlement. A wide bed, a fire pit, shelves carved into the wall, and tall windows that opened to the mountain cliffs. Everything was clean, orderly, and strange. She had everything she could ever need: food, clothes, warmth. And yet, she felt she had nothing at all. Kale never forced himself into her space. He spoke little, his words always measured. At first, she was relieved. She had feared he would treat her as a possession, demand her loyalty, or try to claim her body as his right. But he did none of that. Instead, he treated her almost like a guest. "Do you need anything?" he asked one morning, his deep voice breaking the silence. "No," she answered quickly, keeping her eyes on the floor. "Are you well?" he asked another evening as they sat in the same hall but on opposite sides of the fire. "Yes," she whispered, though her chest ached with loneliness. And that was all. Short words, no warmth, no comfort. Every night, when the fire in her room glowed and shadows stretched across the walls, Elira curled up on the edge of her bed and cried quietly. She pressed her face into the pillow so no sound would carry through the stone halls. She hated this life. She hated the silence that grew heavier with each passing day. But the silence was not empty. It was filled with little things that confused her. One evening, when she walked into the dining hall, she noticed her favorite bread on the table, warm, soft, golden brown. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't even spoken of it in weeks. How did he know? Another night, she returned to her room to find the fire already burning bright, though she had not lit it. The room was warm, safe, welcoming. He must have done it. Why? Why was he doing these small things when he never said anything? Elira's heart warred with itself. One side screamed that this was still a prison, that she was nothing more than payment for her father's weakness. The other side whispered that maybe, just maybe, Kyle wasn't the monster she had painted him to be. But she pushed the thought away. She didn't want to believe it. Believing it meant opening her heart, and opening her heart meant pain. The fortress was always quiet, but it was not empty. Dreskari warriors came and went, their armor clattering against the stone floors, their deep voices echoing through the halls. Sometimes they looked at her with curiosity, sometimes with disdain. A human among their kind was rare, and whispers followed her wherever she walked. "She is only a debt," she heard one of them mutter when they thought she was not listening. A weak human, not worthy of him. Her cheeks burned with shame. She hated how true it felt. And yet, Kale never said such things. He never looked at her with contempt. He never mocked her, or reminded her why she was here. He simply kept his distance, watching quietly from the shadows, as though waiting for something she did not understand. One night, unable to sleep, Elira walked to the window of her room. Outside, the mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks covered in snow that glowed silver under the moon. It was beautiful, breathtaking even, and for a moment she forgot her sorrow. But then she remembered her father's face, his trembling hands when he offered her to the Dreskari. She remembered her vows, the firelight, the silver cords that bound her to Kale. The tears came again. She sank to the floor, clutching her knees to her chest. "I don't belong here," she whispered to the night. "This is not my life. I don't want this." Unbeknownst to her, Kyle had been walking the halls, as he often did late at night. He paused outside her door when he heard the muffled sound of her sobs. His hand hovered near the door, but he did not enter. He stood there for a long moment, his golden eyes dim with a quiet sadness. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into silence. Inside her room, Elira cried until sleep finally claimed her. She dreamed of freedom, of a home she could never return to, and of a man she refused to understand. For now the marriage was only cold walls, heavy silence, and broken hearts. But somewhere, in the quiet of the fortress, Something had already begun to shift. The storm came without warning. One moment, the night sky above the mountains was calm and still. The next, clouds rolled in like dark waves swallowing the moon. Winds howled against the fortress walls, making the torches flicker. Then the lightning came, bright, violent streaks that tore across the heavens. Elira woke with a gasp as thunder shook the room. Her heart pounded, her hands clutched at the blankets. Storms had always frightened her. Even as a child, she would hide under her bed when the sky roared. And now, here in this vast alien fortress, with no one she could call her own, the storm felt even bigger, even louder. The walls rattled as if the whole mountain trembled. She pressed her palms against her ears, but the thunder still reached her chest like a drum. Panic clawed at her. She could not stay in the room. She could not be alone. Her feet carried her before she could think. She pulled the cloak from her chair and wrapped it around herself, rushing down the stone hallway barefoot. Her breath was quick, her steps echoing. She did not know where she was going until she saw the flicker of firelight at the end of the hall. Cale. He stood at the tall window of the main hall, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the storm. The fire burned low in the pit behind him, casting his shadow long across the walls. He looked calm, unshaken by the violence outside, as if storms were nothing to him. Elira froze in the doorway, her breath shallow. She did not want him to see her weakness. But another thunderclap crashed so loud it shook the glass panes. A cry escaped her lips before she could stop it. Cale turned at once. His golden eyes met hers. For a long moment, neither spoke. She wanted to run back to her room to hide from her shame, but her legs would not move. Slowly, Cale walked toward her. He stopped a few paces away, his voice low but steady. "You fear the storm?" It wasn't a question. It was a truth he had already seen. Elira hugged the cloak tighter around herself, looking away. I don't like it." Another flash lit the hall, followed by a roar of thunder. She flinched, shutting her eyes. When she opened them, Kyle was holding out his heavy cloak. Dark, thick, warm. "Here," he said. Hesitant, Elira looked at him. His expression was calm. Not mocking, not pitying. Simply offering. Slowly, she let her hands rise and accepted the cloak. It smelled faintly of smoke and iron, but the warmth sank into her bones the moment she wrapped it around herself. "You are safe here," Kyle said softly. The words struck deeper than the thunder. Safe. She hadn't felt safe in so long, not when the Dreskari first arrived, not at the ceremony, not in her own room. But now, hearing him say it in that steady voice, she felt something inside her chest loosen. Her throat tightened and she whispered, "Why are you being kind?" Kyle tilted his head, his eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. "Because you are my wife, and no storm will harm you while I am here." The way he said it, so firm, so certain, made her knees weak. She lowered her gaze, not trusting her voice. She had sworn she would never feel anything for him. She had sworn to keep her heart locked. But tonight, as the wind screamed and the thunder raged, she could not deny the comfort of his presence. She stayed by the fire after that, sitting on the stone bench while he returned to the window. Neither spoke much. The storm roared outside, but inside the hall there was a stillness that wrapped around her like his cloak. For the first time since her forced marriage, Elira did not feel like a prisoner. She did not feel like a debt. She simply felt safe. When her eyes grew heavy, she leaned against the wall and drifted into sleep. Kyle noticed, turning slightly to watch her. His expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing. He moved quietly, taking another blanket from the chair and draping it over her shoulders before returning to his post. He did not touch her. He did not wake her. He only stood guard while she slept, the storm raging beyond the walls, and that night, for the first time, Elira did not cry herself to sleep. Something had cracked in the silence between them. Small, fragile, but real. The storm passed, but the memory of that night stayed with Elira. She remembered the warmth of Cale's cloak, the firmness in his voice when he told her she was safe. It lingered inside her like a faint light in the darkness. She tried to push it away to remind herself that this was still a marriage born of debt, not choice. But no matter how hard she tried, she could not forget the way her chest had calmed when he stood beside her. Days turned into weeks, and the fortress returned to its quiet routine. Cale rose before dawn, trained with his soldiers, and returned to the hall each evening. Illyra wandered through the stone corridors, sometimes sitting by the window with a book, sometimes helping the kitchen servants prepare meals just to keep herself busy. It was during one of those quiet days that she overheard them. She had gone to fetch water from the courtyard, her steps light as she carried the clay jug. Voices drifted from the training yard nearby, low, harsh, and mocking. "She is only a human," one Dreskari warrior sneered. "A weak creature. How could Cale lower himself to marry such a thing?" Another chuckled. "It was not his choice. She is nothing but payment, a debt wrapped in skin." Their laughter cut through her chest like a blade. Illyra froze, her hands tightening around the jug. She wanted to run, but her feet felt heavy. Their words were cruel, but they echoed the thoughts that already haunted her heart. "I am not his choice. I am not his equal. I am only a debt." Before she could move, a new voice rang out, deep, steady, and unmistakable. "Speak again," Kyle said, "and you will answer to me." The courtyard fell silent. Illyra's breath caught. Carefully, she stepped closer to the shadows of the archway, her heart pounding as she listened. One of the warriors scoffed. "Come now, Captain. You know it is true. She is not of our blood. She will never be one of us." There was a pause. Then Cale's voice came again, low and sharp as steel. "She is my wife. That is all that matters. And if any of you dishonor her again, you dishonor me. Do you wish to test that?" The sound of shifting armor followed. No one answered. Illyra pressed a hand to her chest. Warmth spread through her, mixing with disbelief. He had defended her, not out of duty, not as a captain protecting property, but with conviction, as if he truly meant it. Her eyes stung with tears. For the first time, someone had spoken of her not as a burden, not as a payment, but as a wife. Yet instead of relief, pain filled her. Because the cruel truth remained, she was a debt. No matter how firmly Cale's voice had rung, no matter how fiercely he stood against his men, she knew the reason for her place here. She had been sold, not chosen. That night, the weight inside her heart could no longer be contained. When Cale entered the hall, his steps heavy after a long day, Illyra was already there, pacing near the fire. Her face was pale, her eyes burning, with unshed tears. "Why?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Cale paused, surprised. "Why what? Why do you pretend to care?" Her voice rose, breaking with emotion. "Why defend me in front of them? Why treat me with kindness when we both know what I am? I am not your wife. I am a chain around your neck." The words poured out like a flood, years of frustration and weeks of silent torment breaking free. Her fists clenched at her sides, her whole body shaking. "You don't even know me. You never wanted me. So why act as if—" She stopped, choking on her own tears. Cale stood still for a long moment. His golden eyes, usually so unreadable, softened as he looked at her. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "I know enough." Illyra blinked through her tears. "Enough? Enough of what?" "Enough to see you are worth more than any debt." The words hit her harder than thunder. Her breath caught, her chest tightening as if her heart didn't know whether to break or to heal. She wanted to scream at him again, to deny his words, to push him away, but her voice failed her. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she turned from him, running back to her room before he could see her crumble. Behind her, Kyle remained by the fire, staring into the flames. His hand tightened into a fist, not from anger at her, but from the silent war within himself. He wanted to reach for her. He wanted to tell her everything. But he also knew. Trust could not be forced. In her room, Elira buried her face in the pillows, her sobs muffled by the silence of the fortress. His words replayed again and again in her mind, worth more than any debt. She hated how much she wanted to believe him. Elira avoided Kale for days after their confrontation. She ate her meals quickly, slipping from the hall before he arrived. She kept to her room or wandered the fortress gardens when she knew he was gone. Whenever she heard his footsteps in the corridor, she would turn and retreat the other way. But no matter how far she tried to run from him, his words lingered inside her like a thorn that refused to be pulled out, worth more than any debt. She told herself he was lying, that he was only playing the role expected of him. Yet every memory betrayed her. The bread on the table, the fire lit in her room, the storm when he gave her his cloak, the way he defended her against his own men. These were not the acts of a man pretending, and so confusion gnawed at her heart. She had promised never to feel anything for him, never to let her heart be touched. But something was happening inside her, and she could no longer deny it. It was late one evening when the silence between them finally broke again. Elira had gone to the main hall, carrying a tray of fruit she had taken from the kitchen. She found Kyle sitting at the long table alone, his head bent over a weapon he was polishing. The glow of the fire caught the edges of his face, throwing half of it into shadow. His sleeves were rolled up, and for the first time she noticed his hands clearly. They were scarred. Long white lines crossed his skin, faded but deep. The backs of his knuckles bore old marks from battles fought long before she had ever known his name. His forearms showed burns, cuts, wounds that spoke of pain and struggle. Elira froze, staring. She had never thought of him as vulnerable. He was always strong, composed, silent. But those scars told another story, of a life marked by hardship, of a man who carried burdens just as heavy as hers. Before she could stop herself, she asked softly, "How did you get those?" Kale looked up, his golden eyes meeting hers. For a long moment he said nothing, as if weighing whether to answer. Then he set the weapon down slowly and turned his gaze back to his hands. "War," he said simply. The word was heavy, carrying more than she could imagine. Elira set the tray on the table and stepped closer, curiosity and something gentler stirring within her. "Does it still hurt?" Kale flexed his fingers, his expression unreadable. Not the wounds, but the memories, yes. His honesty surprised her. For days she had convinced herself he was nothing but stone, untouchable. Yet here he was, showing her a crack in the armor. She sat down across from him, her voice quiet. "Then why? Why keep fighting? Why accept me?" The question slipped out before she could take it back. She braced herself for an answer she would hate, that it was duty, that it was nothing personal, that she was simply part of his burden. But Kyle did not say those things. Instead, he looked at her, his gaze steady, almost vulnerable. "Because, when I first saw you, you looked at me like I was a monster." Elira's breath caught. He continued, his voice lower now, softer. "Most do. I have seen it in the eyes of enemies, of strangers, even of my own men at times. But yours was different. It was not just fear, it was sorrow. You saw me not only as a monster, but as a man you wished was not one." Her chest tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She remembered that first day standing in the hall with her wrists bound in silver cords. She remembered looking up at him, praying he would be cruel enough to justify her hatred, or gentle enough to make her feel safe. And yes, she had looked at him with sorrow. Kale lowered his eyes to the scars on his hands. "I wanted to prove I wasn't." Elira's throat ached. She wanted to speak, to tell him she didn't know what to believe anymore. But instead she reached out slowly. Her hand trembled as it brushed against his scarred fingers. Kyle froze, as if afraid to move. Then cautiously he turned his hand and let her hold it. His palm was rough, his skin calloused, but the warmth of his touch spread through her like fire. For the first time since their vows, Elira did not pull away. They sat in silence, the fire crackling, the storm of their emotions louder than the storm that had shaken the fortress days before. Elira's heart pounded, her confusion deepening, but one truth shone clear in that moment. He was no monster, and she was no longer certain she wanted to run. The days after that night felt different. Elira could not explain it, but something inside her had changed. She no longer looked at Cale as only her captor, as only the debt she carried. When she saw him training in the courtyard, she noticed the discipline in his movements, the patience with which he corrected younger warriors. When he passed her, in the hall, she noticed how his eyes softened ever so slightly, as if he wanted to speak but held himself back. And she noticed herself too, how her heart no longer burned with hatred every time she looked at him. How her steps sometimes carried her toward him instead of away. It frightened her. It comforted her. It confused her all at once. But the world never let peace linger for long. One evening, Cale entered her room with something in his hand, a small device that blinked with a faint blue light. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a shadow she had not seen before. "There is a message," he said quietly. Elira sat up from the chair where she had been reading. "From who?" "Your father." Her breath caught. She hadn't heard from him since the day he gave her away. Her hands shook as she took the device. Cale stayed silent, giving her space as she pressed the button. A projection flickered to life, her father's tired face appearing before her. His eyes were wet, his voice trembling. "Elira," he said, "I have done it. I have repaid what remained of my debt. You are free now. The bond can be broken. You don't have to stay with them any longer. You can come home." The message ended. Elira stared at the empty air where his face had been, her chest tightening. Free. She was free. Her hands fell to her lap. She should have felt joy, relief, triumph. But instead she felt something heavier, something more complicated. She turned to Cale, searching his face. He stood by the window, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him. His voice was steady when he spoke. "You owe me nothing. If you wish to leave, I will not stop you." Elira swallowed hard. "And if I stay?" Cale's jaw tightened. He turned his head slightly, but not enough for her to see his eyes. "Then that, too, will be your choice. But I will never hold you in chains." His words cut her deeper than any blade. Because she knew they were true. From the beginning, he had never forced her, never demanded her obedience, never treated her like property. The only chains she had felt were the ones she had built herself. Chains of fear, of anger, of mistrust. That night, Elira lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Freedom was within her grasp. She could walk away from the fortress, from the Driskari, from Kyle. She could return to her people, live her life as she once dreamed. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see freedom. She saw Cale standing in the storm, offering her his cloak. She saw him defending her in the courtyard, his voice sharp as steel. She saw the scars on his hands, the weight in his eyes when he spoke of being seen as a monster. She felt the warmth of his hand in hers, the safety she had found in his silence. And she realized with a shiver, her life was not stolen anymore. It had changed. The question that tormented her was no longer, "Do I want to escape?" but "Do I want to leave him?" When the dawn came, she rose with heavy steps. She found Cale waiting at the gates of the fortress, his armor polished, his cloak drawn tight. He stood as if ready to let her go. His golden eyes met hers. "If you wish to leave, I will see you safely home." Elira's heart pounded. She could barely breathe. The mountains stretched endlessly behind him, the path to freedom opened before her, and yet her feet would not move. Her voice broke when she finally whispered, "I don't know if I can." Cale's face softened, just a flicker, but it was enough to pierce through her confusion. He said nothing more, only waited. The choice was hers. For the first time in her life, it was truly hers. Elira stood at the gates, her chest heavy with 1,000 unspoken words. The morning air was cold, carrying the scent of mountain stone and pine. Before her lay the road back to freedom, the road her father had cleared for her. Behind her stood Kale, silent and strong, offering her nothing but choice. Her heart thundered. She could still hear her father's trembling voice from the message. "You are free now, you don't have to stay." But what was freedom if it meant walking away from the only man who had seen her as more than a bargain? Kale waited patiently. He did not beg, did not plead. He only watched her, his golden eyes unreadable. He was ready to let her go. That was what made the decision harder, because he wanted nothing from her except what she chose to give. At last, Elira's lips trembled as she spoke. "I thought freedom was leaving you, but now I see freedom is choosing who I stay with." Kale's eyes widened just slightly, the faintest crack in his calm mask. For the first time, she saw him unguarded, uncertain. "Elira," he whispered. His voice rough, almost fragile. Tears burned in her eyes as she stepped closer. "You never treated me as a debt. You never chained me. I thought you were my cage, but you became my shelter. And I don't want to leave my shelter." For a long moment, silence hung heavy between them. The sound of the wind filled the air, carrying her words like a vow. Then Kyle exhaled, and it was as if a burden heavier than stone slipped from his shoulders. His hand rose slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid she might vanish. When his fingers brushed her cheek, she leaned into his touch without fear. "You would truly stay, even now that you are free?" he asked. Elira nodded, her tears falling softly. "Yes, not because of duty, not because of debt, but because I want to." Kyle closed his eyes, his forehead lowering until it touched hers. He had faced battles, storms, and enemies who sought his life, yet nothing had ever undone him like this single moment. "Then you are no longer a prisoner," he whispered. "You are my equal, my chosen one." Her heart swelled at those words. For the first time, she felt not like a pawn in someone else's game, but like the author of her own story. The days that followed were different. Where there had once been distance, now there was closeness. Elira walked beside Kale in the courtyard, no longer avoiding his gaze. She spoke freely and he listened, his quiet presence giving weight to every word she said. He began to smile. Small, fleeting smiles that felt like rare treasures only she could unlock. The fortress, too, began to change. The warriors who once whispered about the human bride now looked at her with respect. They saw her not as a symbol of debt, but as Kale's chosen partner. And in Kale's eyes she saw something she had never dared to hope for: tenderness, belonging, love. One night, as they stood on the balcony beneath the stars, Elira whispered, "I used to think my father had destroyed my life by sending me here. But now, I wonder if he unknowingly saved me." Kyle turned to her, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. "And I thought I would live my days as a weapon, feared and obeyed but never loved. Yet here you stand, proving me wrong." Elira smiled through tears, her hand finding his. "Then maybe we both found something neither of us expected." They stood together, hand in hand, as the stars shimmered above like witnesses to their vow. The debt that had once chained them was gone. What remained was something far stronger, something no bargain or blood oath could create. Choice, trust, love. Elira had been forced into marriage to repay her father's debt. But in the end, seeing Kale, not the warlord, not the monster, but the man, changed everything. She had been given freedom, and she chose him.